Welcome, dear listeners, to the quaint village of Rosehill, where cobbled streets glisten under the soft autumn sun and golden leaves twirl lazily to the ground. The scent of freshly baked scones drifts from the village tea shop, mingling with the crisp, earthy air. Church bells ring in gentle cadence, echoing over the rooftops as villagers exchange polite greetings and idle chatter. Yet, beneath this charming facade, a subtle tension stirs, whispers of secrets long buried. From her favorite bench, Miss Marple observes quietly, eyes sharp and thoughtful. Have you ever noticed a secret lurking behind a seemingly peaceful neighbor? Step closer and let the mystery unfold. A chill hung in the air as the villagers of Rosehill gathered at Willowbrook Church, their breaths visible in the frosty morning light. Inside, polished pews gleamed beneath the muted glow of stained glass, and the scent of incense mingled with the faint aroma of damp leaves carried in from outside. Today, they mourned Mrs. Agnes Pembroke, the widow whose quiet life had long been the subject of whispered curiosity. Yet even amidst solemn prayers, subtle oddities made themselves known. A gloved hand trembled as it laid a wreath upon the polished coffin. Hushed disagreements about inheritance slipped into murmurs that no one dared voice aloud. The sexton's old hound lingered by one grave, refusing to budge, its low whine piercing the otherwise silent ceremony. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively near the back, observed all with calm, keen eyes, hesitant glances, uneasy fidgets, the brief flash of tension in a smile. Then, just for a heartbeat, a figure slipped quietly out a side door, unnoticed by most but not by her. Who was that shadow, and why did it move with such care? Behind the widow's 7 graves lay secrets the village had yet to uncover, and Miss Marple, as always, was paying attention. Chapter 1: Shadows over Rosehill. The morning sun fell gently over Rosehill, turning the cobbled streets to a soft gold, and the faint scent of wood smoke drifted from cottage chimneys. Miss Marple strolled along the familiar path by the garden gate, her eyes noting the small details that others often overlooked. The way Mrs. Tilling's hat tilted just slightly to hide a nervous glance, or how the new gardener, young Mr. Langley, lingered too long by the hedge before bending to his work. At the gate, a cluster of villagers had gathered, their voices low yet insistent, spinning tales about Mrs. Pembroke, the recently departed widow whose life had been as enigmatic as it was lengthy. "Did you hear she had 7 husbands?" whispered Mrs. Tilling, her eyes darting toward a neighbor who pretended not to listen. "All gone in the oddest ways, if you believe it. Some say not one was natural." Miss Marple, seated on a nearby bench, sipped her tea and smiled faintly. She listened politely, tilting her head as the stories grew taller with each telling. There were contradictions in the timelines, minor slips that suggested exaggeration or misremembering, yet something deeper tugged at her curiosity. She made careful mental notes, aware that every gossiping tongue left a trail of truth and deception intertwined. Her attention shifted to the smaller oddities. Across the lane, Mr. Harper, the widower who had been a long-time acquaintance of Mrs. Pembroke, avoided her gaze entirely, pretending to inspect the neat hedgerows. A maid from the village fidgeted with the keys dangling from her belt, glancing nervously toward the crowd as if expecting someone or something. Even the church cat prowled close by, its tail twitching with uncharacteristic agitation. Before she could ponder further, a small envelope fluttered through the air and landed delicately at her feet. There was no return address, just her name written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. Miss Marple picked it up, feeling the crisp paper and noting the faint scent of lavender. Her curiosity piqued. The envelope seemed out of place, a silent messenger arriving at precisely the moment the village chatter reached its most charged pitch. Then, as if to punctuate the morning's unease, a sharp scream cut through the air. Villagers turned in alarm to see the source. Near the old cemetery gate, a small figure, fur and tail stiff, lay in a most peculiar pose. The village cat, known for its cunning and quiet prowls, was dead, and its body seemed almost staged, as though someone had deliberately placed it there to attract attention. Gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd. Miss Marple's sharp eyes scanned the scene, noting the patterns, the reactions, and the silent messages hidden in each glance. Could this grim discovery be a mere coincidence or a deliberate warning? An omen tied to the secrets of the widow of 7 graves? Her mind, ever attentive, began piecing together the subtle clues as the morning sun caught the edges of the envelope and the distant gravestones, casting long shadows over Rose Hill. By mid-morning, news of Mrs. Pembroke's will had spread through Rose Hill like wildfire carried on a brisk autumn wind. Villagers who had gathered at the tea shop and along the churchyard path whispered fervently about its peculiarities. Certain items of modest value, an old silver thimble, a faded shawl, a set of delicate porcelain teacups, had been bequeathed to people who, by all appearances, had little connection to the widow. Miss Marple, ever patient and observant, sipped her tea quietly, letting the murmurs wash over her while noting every slip of hesitation, every self-conscious glance. Curiosity led her to the small study where the executor, Mr. Chalmers, a stiff man with thinning hair and nervous fingers, awaited visitors. "Odd choices, aren't they?" she asked, not accusing, merely stating. His thin lips twitched in an uncertain smile, while a hint of color betrayed his discomfort. Villagers hovered nearby, feigning casual interest while casting furtive glances toward the papers spread across the polished desk. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the subtle signs, the clenched hands, the way certain guests avoided eye contact, and the occasional stifled laughter that hinted at unease rather than amusement. Her attention wandered to a narrow drawer left slightly ajar at the edge of the desk. With a gentle nudge, she discovered it contained letters, neatly tied with a ribbon, and a small leather-bound notebook whose pages hinted at confidential correspondence. The contents, though she could not yet fully read them, suggested matters of delicate importance, matters that the ordinary village eyes would overlook. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple joined a small gathering for tea, the clink of china blending with the aroma of warm seed cake. Conversation, carefully observed, was sprinkled with cryptic remarks, offhand comments, loaded pauses, and subtle nudges at one another that revealed underlying tensions. A key witness, Mr. Harper, who had been the source of much gossip, vanished mid-tea, leaving behind a chair still warm with his presence and a silent air of unease. Villagers speculated in hushed tones, yet Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, connecting dots invisible to the casual observer. By evening, as the sky deepened into twilight, a folded piece of paper slid through her letterbox. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the elegant handwriting, unfamiliar yet deliberate. Unfolding it, she read the single line, "Stop asking questions, or you will regret it." The words were calm, almost polite in tone, yet they carried an unmistakable weight, a warning cloaked in civility. Sitting by the hearth, Miss Marple traced the edges of the paper, her thoughts deliberate and precise. In Rose Hill, even a seemingly innocuous note could conceal danger, and the layers of intrigue surrounding the widow of 7 graves were growing more tangled by the hour. A quiet determination settled over her. She would not be deterred, not even by threats veiled in polite handwriting. The village had secrets, and it was her task, as always, to see them clearly before the truth could be buried forever. Chapter 2. Whispers Beneath the Willow. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows of the widow Pembroke's former residence, painting long, golden rectangles across the polished wooden floors. Miss Marple had been invited to the house by the household staff, who whispered nervously as they dusted and arranged flowers, as though the very walls might overhear their confidences. Footsteps had been heard at odd hours. Small objects disappeared only to reappear in peculiar places, and one visitor, an unfamiliar man, always asking delicate questions about the widow's affairs, had unsettled everyone from the moment he arrived. Miss Marple observed quietly from the doorway, her eyes taking in every detail. The measured timing of the maid's movements, the careful placement of items, the anxious glance cast toward the rear stairs. It was clear to her that the disturbances were not merely accidents or forgetfulness. There was purpose behind them, a choreography executed under the guise of domestic routine. The village constable arrived mid-afternoon, his coat dusted with the last remnants of the cobbled streets, confident that all complaints were minor. Nothing but ordinary household mishaps, he assured the staff, though his eyes occasionally flicked to corners where shadows gathered. Miss Marple, however, had learned long ago that ordinary explanations often concealed extraordinary motives. Her attention was drawn to the fireplace in the sitting room, a grand, oak-paneled structure that seemed to dominate the space with a quiet authority. As she examined the hearth, her fingers traced a narrow seam, and a small panel gave way with gentle pressure. Inside lay a hidden compartment, dusty with disuse, partially filled with yellowed letters tied neatly with a fraying ribbon. She carefully lifted the bundle, noting the careful handwriting, the faint scent of lavender, and the crisp rustle of paper that hinted at secrets long kept from prying eyes. As she skimmed the top letter, a chill ran through her, for the words hinted at family scandal, discreet allusions to disputes over inheritance, delicate alliances, and veiled accusations. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. The widow's life, she realized, had been far more entangled than the village suspected. Something about the phrasing suggested a dispute that went beyond mere domestic tension, something that might cast the widow's death in a suspicious light. The staff moved quietly around her, their whispers like soft wind through the corridors, unaware of the importance of the discovery. The constable busied himself elsewhere, oblivious to the potential weight of these letters. Miss Marple, however, had learned that true understanding came from patience and observation, and she carefully replaced the letters, making a note to investigate further. A final glance at the hidden compartment revealed more than dust and paper. It revealed possibility, intrigue, and the faint outline of a secret carefully preserved. The widow's death, long assumed to be natural, now seemed clouded with unanswered questions, and Miss Marple felt the familiar stirrings of determination. Someone in Rosehill had more to hide than even the cleverest gossip had dared to suggest. By late morning, the village of Rosehill had turned its collective attention toward Mr. Ernest Larkins, the local shopkeeper whose temper and stubbornness were as well known as his neatly arranged shelves. Whispers followed him along the cobbled streets. He argued fiercely with the widow about accounts, one villager muttered, while another nodded, eyes wide with suspicion. Even those usually immune to gossip felt a frisson of excitement as speculation about his possible involvement grew. Miss Marple approached the shop under the pretense of buying a loaf of bread, observing the man with quiet scrutiny. Mr. Larkins greeted her politely, though there was a tension in the set of his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed nervously on the counter. His voice remained calm, even charming, but the careful observer would notice small cracks. A glance flicking to the clock above the door, a subtle hesitation before answering her questions about the widow's recent visits and his financial dealings. As customers came and went, Miss Marple noted inconsistencies in his story. He mentioned delivering goods to the widow on days that did not match the village ledger, and when asked about a disagreement over a missing shipment, his eyes briefly betrayed a flicker of irritation before returning to forced composure. Every detail seemed trivial, yet when pieced together, patterns emerged, patterns invisible to the casual listener, but clear to someone accustomed to reading between the lines. Outside the shop window, a shadow lingered, a tall figure half hidden behind the elm tree, watching the shopkeeper with deliberate patience. Miss Marple's sharp gaze caught the movement, though she did not draw attention to it, allowing the figure to blend seamlessly with the passing crowd. She filed the observation carefully, knowing that subtle surveillance often revealed more than direct confrontation. That evening, as a pale moon rose over the village, the air carried an unusual chill. Villagers retired to their homes, unaware of the subtle mischief unfolding in the graveyard behind Willowbrook Church. There, under the shroud of darkness, someone approached the widow Pembroke's gravestone. Hands gloved and steady, adjusted the marker ever so slightly, tilting it as if to signal, or perhaps conceal, a secret. A faint rustle in the leaves betrayed the presence of another figure nearby, silent and watchful, as though ensuring the deed was accomplished without notice. Miss Marple, reclining by her window with a cup of tea, had no way of knowing exactly who tampered with the gravestone that night. Yet a subtle intuition pricked at her mind, a feeling that this act, so deliberate and calculated, was connected to the intricate web surrounding the widow of 7 graves. The shopkeeper, the shadowy observer, and the tilted marker. Each piece of the puzzle whispered its own warning, hinting that the calm village of Rosehill was only pretending to sleep. Chapter 3: Secrets Among the Stones. A heavy, misty morning hung over Rosehill as Miss Marple made her way toward the churchyard, the gravel crunching softly beneath her sensible shoes. The air was damp with the scent of rain yet to fall, and the faint sound of church bells told in slow, measured intervals. Her gaze fell upon the row of 7 graves behind the ancient stone church, neatly aligned and uniform, each topped with a modest headstone. From a distance, they might have appeared ordinary, even serene, but Miss Marple knew better. Every detail, no matter how small, held a story. She bent close, inspecting the inscriptions with careful eyes. Most were worn, the carved letters softened by decades of weather. Yet she noted subtle discrepancies, a misaligned name here, a slightly deeper engraving there. The spacing of dates, the slight tilt of one stone, and the variation in erosion suggested patterns that might not be accidental. Perhaps they were deliberate signals, symbols left by someone who wished to communicate through subtlety rather than words. Villagers passed by in pairs or small groups, their voices low as they murmured about curses and old misfortunes, as though speaking too loudly might awaken hidden dangers. 7 graves, 7 misfortunes, one whispered, glancing nervously at Miss Marple as she knelt to examine the ground. Their fear seemed almost theatrical, yet she detected genuine apprehension beneath the gossip, a knowledge that the widow's life, and perhaps her death, had unsettled the natural order of the village. A sudden gust of wind swept through the churchyard, rattling the branches of the yew trees, and moments later, fat, heavy drops of rain began to fall. The villagers hurried indoors, their umbrellas collapsing with a soft, wet snap. Miss Marple remained, unfazed by the storm, her coat buttoned tightly and her hat shielding her eyes as she continued her examination. The rain tapped a rhythm against the headstones, the sound oddly comforting in its constancy. It was then, behind the sixth grave, that her eyes caught a subtle disturbance in the soil. The earth had been freshly turned, dark and damp, and there was no marker to indicate a burial. Kneeling carefully, Miss Marple pressed her fingers against the surface, noting the compacted soil and slight impressions that suggested recent activity. Someone had dug here in secret, under the cloak of night, or perhaps during a distracted moment when no one was watching. She straightened, her eyes scanning the perimeter for any sign of movement, but the churchyard was deserted. Only the 7 graves and their quiet presence remained. Yet this hidden eighth plot whispered a story all its own, a story the village had yet to acknowledge. The widow of 7 graves, it seemed, was not finished revealing her secrets, and Miss Marple felt the familiar stirrings of anticipation that came with a puzzle demanding to be solved. Something, or someone, was hiding beneath the surface, and it was only a matter of time before the truth emerged. The following morning, a stranger arrived in Rose Hill, stepping from the early mist with an air of quiet urgency. His coat was well cut but slightly worn at the edges, and his hat shadowed his eyes as he approached the village center. Word spread swiftly. He claimed to be a long-lost relative of the late Mrs. Agnes Pembroke, someone who had been estranged for decades, yet now had returned to settle lingering family matters. The villagers, ever curious and a touch suspicious, gathered in small knots near the tea shop and churchyard, exchanging speculations in low tones. Miss Marple, as always, observed without appearing to do so. She noted the stranger's careful gaze as it lingered on the churchyard, particularly the 7 graves and the disturbed earth behind the 6th stone. When she finally approached him, her manner was unassuming, almost conversational, yet her eyes missed nothing. "It must be a long journey from your family home," she began gently. "I wonder what drew you to Rose Hill after all this time." The man shifted uneasily, a faint flush rising to his temples. His answers were polite but vague, touching on distant relatives and forgotten family traditions, yet avoiding specifics when pressed. Miss Marple's keen sense of observation caught the subtle tells: a tight grip on his walking stick, the occasional darting glance toward the churchyard gates, and the slight hesitation before each response. Something about his eagerness to see the graves, and the way he lingered on mentions of the widow's past, hinted at motives beyond familial curiosity. The villagers watched from a respectful distance, intrigued by the newcomer's refined manners but wary of his intensity. Children scuttled by with lingering glances, and shopkeepers paused in mid-activity, sensing that the arrival of a stranger always brought a ripple of disturbance to the calm village routine. By late afternoon, the man had spent hours wandering the cemetery, his eyes flicking to the old stones, the cryptic inscriptions, and even the freshly disturbed soil behind the 6th grave. Miss Marple trailed discreetly, asking casual questions about distant family connections, the widow's affairs, and local history. Every answer offered by the visitor carried a shadow of hesitation, and yet he seemed determined to appear uninformed, as though he wanted her to know he knew more than he admitted. Just as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long, golden shafts through the elm trees, Miss Marple glimpsed movement from the corner of her eye. The stranger, now carrying a small, cloth-wrapped bundle, hastened along the lane leading out of the village. His steps were hurried, deliberate, and purposeful. The package appeared to be one of the widow's personal items, an object of value or significance, though its contents remained hidden beneath the cloth. Miss Marple paused, noting the sudden urgency, the way the stranger avoided the main streets, and the subtle tension in his posture. Whoever he was, his interest in the widow of 7 graves went far deeper than a polite, familial curiosity. The village, ever so calm in daylight, was now charged with the silent promise of secrets yet to be revealed, and Miss Marple, as always, intended to uncover them. Chapter 4. Tea and Treachery. The afternoon sun slanted gently through the lace-curtained windows of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting warm patterns across the polished tea table. A delicate fragrance of freshly brewed Earl Grey mingled with the sweet aroma of seed cake, and the gentle ticking of the mantel clock provided a comforting rhythm to the otherwise tense gathering. Villagers had arrived under the pretense of friendly conversation and polite tea, yet beneath the surface, a web of unease and curiosity threaded through each word and glance. Mrs. Tilling, always quick with a sharp observation, fidgeted with her teacup while recounting the latest rumors about the widow's will. Her voice dipped conspiratorially as she mentioned the missing silver thimble and the peculiar visitor who had arrived claiming family ties. Mr. Harper added his own notes of caution, hinting at disagreements over the graves and the recently tampered marker. Miss Marple listened, her keen mind noting discrepancies and subtle contradictions. Each slip, each hesitation, a piece of a larger puzzle. Even the servants, who moved quietly behind the guests, contributed unwittingly to the tapestry of clues. A misplaced brooch, left conspicuously on the windowsill, caught her attention, as did the coded remarks whispered over scones. Phrases that sounded innocent enough, but carried layered meanings for those who understood the village's intricate dynamics. Miss Marple's eyes traveled from face to face, cataloging nervous glances, fleeting smiles, and slight shifts in posture that hinted at concealed knowledge or unspoken fears. As conversation progressed, Miss Marple began connecting the threads. The gossip about the 7 graves, the anonymous letters she had received, and the stranger who had visited the village. Patterns emerged, subtle yet undeniable. She leaned slightly forward, suggesting a question about the hidden compartment in the widow's study, without drawing attention to it. Some guests responded openly, others avoided her gaze, but each reaction offered a clue she carefully stored in her mind. Suddenly, a soft thud interrupted the measured cadence of the afternoon. One of the younger guests, overcome by faintness, perhaps from nerves, perhaps from the weight of concealed knowledge, collapsed to the floor. In the confusion, a small envelope slid across the polished floor, coming to rest near Miss Marple's feet. She bent to retrieve it, her sharp eyes catching the familiar flourish of her name scrawled across the front. The room hushed, breaths held, as she carefully unfolded the paper. The note was brief, its message terse yet unmistakable. Someone had left it in haste, and the words carried an urgent, silent warning. Miss Marple's gaze flicked around the room, noting the startled faces and anxious murmurs. Who had delivered this message, and what secrets were now being revealed so suddenly? The afternoon's revelations, it seemed, were only just beginning, and the hidden forces at play in Rosehill were growing ever more deliberate, weaving tension into the village's otherwise serene charm. Miss Marple sat quietly by the window, the afternoon light softening her features as she studied the note that had fallen at her feet. The paper was simple, yet the handwriting hinted at urgency and unease. As she read and reread the terse message, patterns began to emerge. Subtle references to financial irregularities, coded mentions of inheritance disputes, and the faintest suggestions of family betrayal. The widow of 7 graves, it seemed, had left more entangled affairs than the village had suspected, and someone was determined to ensure these secrets remained buried. Outside, the village constable had begun formal inquiries. He was a man of sincere intention but limited imagination, and his suspicion quickly settled upon the shopkeeper, Mr. Larkins, whose prior disputes with the widow made him an obvious, if superficial, target. Witnesses were questioned, alibis inspected, and yet Miss Marple observed that his discomfort was more irritation than guilt. While the constable pursued the wrong trail, she quietly noted the inconsistencies that would later prove crucial. Footprints along the lane that did not match the shopkeeper's shoes, half-burnt letters in the hearth of the village tea shop, and discreet glances exchanged between villagers who pretended ignorance. Miss Marple traced each clue with patience, following invisible threads that led her from the shop to the churchyard, from the inn to the widow's former study. Each observation reinforced her growing sense that appearances were misleading. Villagers smiled and offered polite conversation, yet beneath the surface, hidden motives stirred: anxiety over inheritance, embarrassment over secrets, and fear of scandal. Even the most mundane movements, a hand brushing against a banister, a brief glance toward a window, told a story if one knew how to read it. As twilight descended and shadows deepened in the quiet streets, Miss Marple returned home, carrying her observations with the careful weight of someone threading together a delicate puzzle. The village seemed calm, the smoke rising lazily from chimneys, the evening bells echoing softly. Yet the sense of unease persisted, lingering in the corners of her mind. A sudden tap at the door startled her. Rising slowly, she opened it to find a small, folded note pinned to the wood, as though thrust through the keyhole by unseen hands. The handwriting was unfamiliar, jagged, and urgent. She carefully unfolded it and read the single chilling line. "Curiosity will cost you, Mrs. Marple. Ask no more, or you'll regret it." Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line, her mind already sifting through the possibilities. The warning was deliberate, a clear attempt to deter her from uncovering the truth. And yet, as always, it only strengthened her resolve. In Rosehill, even polite threats were not enough to obscure the patterns of human nature, patterns she intended to follow to their very end. The night deepened, the village quieted, but the sense of hidden agendas lingered, pressing close, whispering of secrets that would not remain hidden for long. Chapter 5: Shadows of Doubt. The village of Rosehill woke to a somber, yet oddly satisfied, ere the following morning. Word had spread quickly. Mr. Ernest Larkins, the local shopkeeper whose arguments with the late widow had been the subject of constant gossip, had been arrested by the constable. The charges were based entirely on circumstantial evidence, disputed accounts of deliveries, eyewitnesses recalling fleeting moments of disagreement, and the ill-timed presence of the stranger who had visited the village in recent days. The villagers gathered in clusters along the cobbled streets, some nodding approvingly at the constable's decisive action, others whispering quietly about justice finally being served. At last, someone is held accountable. Mrs. Tilling murmured to her companion, though her eyes flicked nervously toward the churchyard, as if she sensed that the story was not yet complete. Children peered curiously from behind hedges, and the shopkeeper's employees exchanged quiet glances, their expressions a mixture of relief and apprehension. Miss Marple, however, felt none of the village's satisfaction. Sitting on her familiar bench, she observed Mr. Larkins as he was led toward the constable's carriage, his shoulders squared, his expression calm. There was a dignity in his composure, a quiet patience that suggested innocence rather than guilt. Small inconsistencies in the testimonies against him nagged at her mind. The misremembered times of deliveries, the misidentified movements of the stranger, and the vague details of arguments that seemed rehearsed when repeated aloud. Her sharp eyes scanned the gathered villagers, noting subtle alliances forming and quiet conversations behind closed hands. Neighbors who had previously exchanged polite greetings now lingered near one another, sharing glances and hints that suggested unspoken strategies. Even the churchwarden, usually reticent, seemed unusually attentive to the constable's every action, a slight twitch in his posture betraying interest beyond mere civic duty. Before he was ushered into the carriage, Mr. Larkin spoke softly, just loud enough for Miss Marple to hear. His words carried a measured weight, careful yet pointed. "You may think you know, but the truth lies elsewhere, Mrs. Marple. Watch carefully. One day, it will reveal itself." His eyes met hers briefly, and though the constable tugged at his sleeve to move him along, the message lingered. It was not a confession, nor a plea, but a hint, a deliberate nudge to someone attentive enough to perceive it. As the carriage rattled down the narrow streets toward the station, the constable appeared triumphant, while the villagers murmured their approval. Yet Miss Marple remained seated, her mind alive with questions. The shopkeeper's calm demeanor, his careful words, and the subtle gestures of those around him all suggested that the surface story was far from complete. Beneath the seeming closure, the web of intrigue in Rose Hill continued to shift and twist. Hidden motives and clandestine alliances, subtle as shadows, had begun to reveal themselves to Miss Marple's keen eyes. And though the village rejoiced in the arrest, she sensed that the real culprit had yet to make a misstep. Somewhere among them, a secret waited, patient and quiet, ready to be uncovered by those wise enough to see beyond appearances. The following afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the widow's house, seeking clarity where the village gossip and police work had only offered confusion. The air was thick with the lingering scent of lavender from Mrs. Pembroke's personal effects, mingling faintly with the ever-present aroma of wood smoke from the hearth. As she moved through the familiar rooms, her eyes fell upon a small, inconspicuous drawer in the widow's writing desk, long overlooked by the constable and villagers alike. With careful fingers, she opened it and discovered a leather-bound diary, its cover soft and worn, revealing pages filled with elegant, precise handwriting. The diary was a window into the widow's hidden world. Entries revealed long-held grudges towards certain neighbors, secret meetings with unfamiliar visitors, and coded phrases that hinted at alliances and betrayals. One passage, particularly cryptic, referenced the 7 locks and a conversation in the garden by candlelight, leaving Miss Marple's mind turning with possibilities. Each detail reinforced her suspicion that the widow's life had been far more complicated than anyone in Rose Hill suspected. As she read, a sudden commotion from the village center drew her attention. Word had spread quickly of an incident at the bakery. A tray of freshly baked pastries had been tampered with, the contents rendered suspiciously bitter and unsafe. Thankfully, no one had been harmed, but the attempted poisoning confirmed what Miss Marple had quietly suspected for some time. Someone in Rose Hill was escalating, testing boundaries, and willing to act with subtle malice when opportunity arose. With her keen mind weaving the diary's revelations together with the recent incidents, Miss Marple noted the careful choreography of the perpetrator's actions. Each step, each small threat, seemed to serve a purpose: intimidation, distraction, or diversion. She realized that the individual behind the widow's death and the escalating disturbances was someone patient, clever, and intimately familiar with village life, someone who assumed they could stay hidden behind polite facades. As evening settled over Rose Hill, Miss Marple returned to her own home, diary and notes in hand, reflecting on the delicate balance of trust in the village. She understood now that certain villagers were wary of her insight, treating her observations with polite dismissal. Yet they also knew she would see through any deception eventually. The thought settled uncomfortably. The person responsible distrusted her, yet simultaneously recognized the power of her quiet, relentless scrutiny. Sitting by the fire with a cup of tea, Miss Marple traced the edges of the diary, turning over each revelation in her mind. Someone close to the village had underestimated her, assuming that age and civility would dull her attention. But as she gazed into the flickering flames, a familiar resolve took hold. Secrets, no matter how carefully buried, could not escape the patient eyes of those who truly observed. And in Rose Hill, Miss Marple knew the truth was poised to emerge, one subtle clue at a time. Chapter 6. The Widow's Web. The morning air in Rose Hill carried a crispness that hinted at approaching winter, and Miss Marple took advantage of the quiet streets to visit the villagers whose lives intersected most closely with the late Mrs. Pembroke. She moved deliberately, visiting homes where the widow's acquaintances gathered, asking seemingly innocuous questions while her mind catalogued every gesture, hesitation, and phrase. Each encounter offered small revelations. A flicker of nervousness at a mention of the widow's fortune, a subtle tightening of hands over a teacup, or an offhand remark that suggested tensions far older than anyone admitted. She began by speaking with the widower's former acquaintances, tracing the delicate threads of financial motives and property disputes. Gentle probing revealed family rivalries carefully concealed under layers of politeness. Whispered arguments over inheritances, long-forgotten debts, and lingering resentment surfaced gradually, filtered through polite denials and forced smiles. Miss Marple noted every inconsistency, knowing that the truth often hid behind the most ordinary-seeming words. Her attention then turned to romantic entanglements. A hint of jealousy here, a clandestine meeting mentioned there. Each minor detail was a thread in the intricate web the widow had spun over decades. The widow's letters, previously found in the hidden compartment, confirmed suspicions. Coded language, cryptic references to trustees and arrangements, and allusions to long-standing grievances between her husbands suggested careful planning. Miss Marple cross-referenced these insights with the graves she had observed so closely. The inscriptions, the alignment of the stones, and the subtle variations she had noted before, all seemed to point toward a pattern. Each husband's burial held a small clue, a shift in dates, a slightly unusual wording, a symbol that might indicate sequence or hierarchy. When matched with the diary entries and the village gossip she had painstakingly catalogued, a coherent narrative began to emerge. By late afternoon, Miss Marple sat in quiet reflection, her tea untouched beside her. A pattern had begun to reveal itself, linking not only the widow's financial dealings but also her personal life. Her 7 husbands, once considered disparate and unfortunate, now appeared connected by a hidden scheme. Certain letters hinted at secret arrangements, small legacies, and a chain of inheritances designed to conceal the true beneficiary. The complexity of the web was remarkable, yet Miss Marple's mind, patient and meticulous, began to trace the connections with clarity. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting long shadows over Rose Hill, her sharp eyes caught a detail that made her breath pause. A subtle correlation between dates, locations, and the mysterious movements of villagers that suggested the widow's fortune had been manipulated long before her final days. The pattern was unmistakable. The 7 husbands, the graves, and the inheritance were all pieces of a careful, deliberate scheme. Someone in Rose Hill had played a long, quiet game, and Miss Marple, as always, was now poised to see it through to its conclusion. The village fete arrived on a crisp morning, the stalls draped in bright bunting and tables laden with cakes, preserves, and freshly picked flowers. The air was alive with laughter, the soft strains of a piano, and the gentle hum of conversation. Rosehill's residents moved through the fair with carefree steps, unaware that beneath the gaiety, Miss Marple had woven a delicate plan. Every smile, every polite greeting, and every casual remark would serve as a thread in the trap she had set. Miss Marple positioned herself near the central gazebo, where a display of antique trinkets and curiosities drew a steady flow of visitors. She had intentionally included a small selection of items connected to the widow, letters, photographs, and keepsakes, carefully arranged so that only those with guilty knowledge might react. Her sharp eyes scanned the crowd, noting which villagers lingered longer than necessary, whose glances flicked towards certain objects, and whose hands twitched with subtle anxiety. Conversations were orchestrated with gentle precision. She inquired about minor details of the widow's estate, mentioned the seemingly trivial disturbances around the graves, and allowed comments about the mysterious visitor to drift into the air. To the casual observer, it was idle chatter, but Miss Marple was observing a pattern, watching for reactions that betrayed more than words could convey. Among the crowd, one figure shifted uneasily, hands pressed briefly to the chest, eyes darting toward the hidden letters, and lips moving in what might have been whispered self-reassurance. All signals Miss Marple had anticipated. She leaned slightly forward, speaking softly to a neighbor nearby, knowing the words would reach the culprit through overheard fragments, nudging them toward revealing themselves. The plan was subtle. No accusations, no confrontation, only careful observation and psychological pressure. Then, amid the cheerful clamor of the fate, the culprit made a sudden, reckless movement. A hand reached impulsively toward one of the widow's personal items, almost revealing knowledge that should have remained secret. The gesture was brief, easily missed by all but the most attentive observer, but Miss Marple's eyes caught it instantly. She noted the color that rose to the person's cheeks, the small, faltering step, and the fleeting panic that passed across their face. The villagers around them remained blissfully unaware, clapping for a nearby performance or sampling the home-baked goods, while Miss Marple's mind catalogued every detail. The trap was working. The culprit's own nerves and impulses were beginning to betray them, drawing them closer to exposure with each passing moment. Miss Marple, sipping her tea with calm precision, allowed the moment to unfold. The stage was set, the pieces aligned, and the carefully orchestrated tension hummed beneath the surface of the cheerful fate. Soon, the truth would begin to emerge, not through confrontation, but through the quiet, inevitable unraveling of deceit as the guilty party revealed their hand without realizing it. Chapter 7: Confessions at Candlelight. That evening, Miss Marple's sitting room glowed with a gentle flicker of candlelight, casting elongated shadows across the walls lined with well-worn books and delicate china. The atmosphere was deliberately cozy, with the rich scent of tea blending softly with the faint aroma of roasted chestnuts. Villagers had been invited under the guise of a quiet tea party, each guest unaware that they were stepping into a web carefully designed to reveal hidden truths. Miss Marple served tea with her usual calm, observing as each guest moved, spoke, and reacted to the warmth of the room. The soft clink of cups and saucers provided a rhythm that she used to pace her inquiries, asking gentle, seemingly inconsequential questions about the widow's affairs, the 7 graves, and the recent disturbances in the village. Every answer was measured, yet every gesture, hesitation, or glance was meticulously noted. Her mind catalogued inconsistencies with precision. Mr. Harper, who had seemed so certain of the shopkeeper's guilt, faltered when asked about the timing of his own visits to the widow. The mysterious visitor's story, previously vague, wavered when probed about certain letters and family connections. Even long-standing villagers, seemingly unconnected to the events, offered contradictory recollections when Miss Marple mentioned the tampered gravestone or the subtle rearrangements of personal effects. The room remained serene in appearance, the flickering candles disguising the tension that lay beneath polite smiles. Miss Marple's questioning was never accusatory, yet created small, deliberate pressures, pauses that encouraged unguarded remarks, observations designed to provoke subtle reactions. She noted a hand trembling slightly when a particular topic arose, an involuntary shift in posture at the mention of the widow's secret inheritance, and a quick glance toward the window that suggested worry about someone approaching. Then, in a moment almost imperceptible, the culprit made their first mistake. A subtle glance toward the door, a faint tightening of lips, a hurried adjustment of clothing, all signs of a desire to leave unnoticed. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and patient, caught the movement instantly. Though the other villagers remained engaged in polite conversation, she recognized the implications immediately. Someone among them was attempting to evade discovery, to slip away before the delicate web of observation could ensnare them fully. Miss Marple allowed the moment to linger, giving the would-be escapee just enough time to act impulsively, knowing that their own nerves would betray them more fully than any direct accusation ever could. She sipped her tea with the utmost composure, her gaze never wavering from the subtle movements, cataloging every micro-expression, every tiny twitch. The confrontation was not loud, not dramatic, yet it was deliberate, precise, and in its quiet unfolding, the culprit's intent began to reveal itself. As the candlelight flickered across the room, shadows danced in ways that seemed almost conspiratorial, reflecting the hidden tensions Miss Marple had so patiently observed. The stage was set for the final unraveling. The truth lingered just beyond the polite conversation, poised to emerge from the careful scrutiny of a mind that had long understood the subtleties of human nature. The flickering candlelight seemed to hold its breath as Miss Marple finally spoke, her voice calm, yet commanding, carrying the weight of a mind that had pieced together every subtle clue. "It is clear," she began, "that the disturbances in Rosehill, the tampered graves, the anonymous notes, even the attempted misdirection toward Mr. Larkins, were not random acts. They were deliberate, orchestrated to conceal the actions of one individual, a relative, distant but cunning, who sought to exploit the widow's fortune while manipulating the villagers' trust." A hush fell over the room as eyes widened, and murmurs rippled through the gathered company. The mysterious visitor, previously assumed to be merely an estranged family member, stiffened, the mask of composure finally slipping. Miss Marple continued, tracing the intricate path of deception. The coded letters hidden in the widow's secret compartment, the carefully misaligned headstones that hinted at inheritance patterns, and the seemingly trivial quarrels and disappearances that had distracted the village. Each small detail, once overlooked, formed a coherent narrative that could not be denied. She described how the culprit had exploited the trust of neighbors, used minor gossip to divert suspicion, and even orchestrated false leads toward Mr. Larkins. The subtle patterns in behavior, the nervous glances, the fleeting hesitations, and the careful positioning of items, were all threads in a fabric designed to obscure the truth. Miss Marple's voice never rose, yet the clarity of her reasoning made the room tense with revelation. Gasps of shock and relief passed among the villagers. Some clasped their hands to their mouths. Others exchanged stunned looks, realizing that the peace of their village had been disturbed by someone they had scarcely suspected. Mr. Harper, who had been so confident in the shopkeeper's guilt, slumped into his chair, muttering apologies for his misjudgment. The culprit, seated rigidly in the corner, could no longer maintain the pretense of innocence. The weight of Miss Marple's observations was undeniable. With a subtle smile, Miss Marple concluded, "Every step you took, every note you left, every gesture and glance, all of it has been recorded in the careful memory of those who observe more than they seem. The truth, while patient, has a way of emerging, even in a village as quiet as Rosehill." Yet, as the room slowly regained a sense of composure, a final detail caught Miss Marple's eye, a corner of one letter she had not yet fully examined, partially hidden beneath the teapot. Its faint, cryptic markings hinted that the widow had still more secrets, stories long buried that might yet come to light. She allowed a pause, letting the weight of that thought settle among the villagers, a reminder that while the immediate danger had passed, the full tapestry of the widow's life remained only partially revealed. The villagers absorbed the revelation, relief mingling with lingering curiosity, while Miss Marple, serene and quietly satisfied, allowed herself a small, knowing smile. The widow of 7 graves had finally surrendered her most immediate secrets, yet the final twist lingered in the shadows. In Rosehill, as in life, some truths remained just out of reach, waiting for the observant mind to uncover them in time. Chapter 8. Autumn Light over Rosehill. Autumn settled gently over Rosehill, painting the village in shades of amber, gold, and russet. The air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves, mingling with smoke curling from chimneys and the faint sweetness of baked pies drifting from kitchen windows. Life, once tense and shadowed by recent events, began to resume its tranquil rhythm. Villagers emerged from the uneasy hush that had followed the revelations, tentatively greeting one another with smiles that were hesitant but sincere. Miss Marple moved quietly among them, her presence both comforting and reassuring. She visited the shop, where Mr. Larkins had returned to his daily duties, offering a few gentle words to ease lingering resentment. At the churchyard, she encouraged neighbors to reconcile, reminding them of the importance of civility and community, even after the unsettling secrets of the widow had come to light. Her calm wisdom, delivered with warmth rather than reproach, helped smooth ruffled tempers and reminded the villagers of the steady rhythm of everyday life. Tea tables were set once more, and conversation shifted back to ordinary matters. The harvest festival, the state of the gardens, the forthcoming winter preparations. Laughter, soft but genuine, returned to the streets of Rosehill, and children played under the golden trees without the shadow of suspicion that had previously hung over them. Even those who had been closest to the widow's affairs began to find comfort in routine, their relief mirrored in the gentle, autumnal light that bathed the village. Yet amid this restored calm, Miss Marple's keen eyes caught a subtle detail, a small token, inconspicuous yet unmistakable, that had been overlooked among the widow's belongings. Perhaps a brooch, a folded letter, or a delicate trinket of personal significance. It seemed almost deliberately hidden, waiting to be discovered. Its presence was a gentle reminder that, even in closure, some threads remained loose, minor mysteries lingering like shadows at the edge of understanding. She picked it up carefully, turning it over in her hands and allowing her mind to ponder its meaning. The villagers, busy with their routines, noticed only her serene composure and assumed she was attending to trivial matters. Yet Miss Marple understood that even small artifacts could carry stories, hints of untold secrets waiting patiently to be revealed. As the sun dipped lower, casting a warm, amber glow across the cobbled streets and the rooftops of Rose Hill, a sense of balance returned. The village breathed once more, the tensions of the past weeks softening into memories, the kindness and gossip of everyday life resuming with gentle rhythm. And while most of the widow of Seven Graves mysteries had been unveiled, the small token whispered to Miss Marple that perhaps the past still held subtle surprises, reminding her, and the village, that in Rose Hill, the ordinary and the extraordinary often walked hand in hand. The garden behind Miss Marple's cottage glowed with the soft, golden light of late afternoon, leaves rustling gently in the crisp autumn breeze. She sat quietly on her favorite bench, hands folded in her lap, eyes wandering over the neat rows of chrysanthemums and marigolds, and beyond them, toward the churchyard where the seven graves rested in solemn order. The village, now brimming with the hum of everyday life, seemed at peace, yet Miss Marple's mind lingered on the complexities she had witnessed, on the charming facades that concealed ambition, greed, and subtle malice. As villagers prepared for the harvest festival, stringing garlands and arranging baskets of produce, laughter and cheerful chatter filled the air. Children chased one another across the square, and neighbors greeted one another with renewed warmth. The ordinary rhythms of Rose Hill, once fractured by suspicion and secrecy, had returned. Yet Miss Marple understood that beneath the veneer of restored calm, human nature remained as intricate and unpredictable as ever. Politeness could hide envy, smiles could cloak deceit, and the smallest gesture might reveal far more than a loud confession ever could. Sipping her tea, she reflected on the lessons woven through the weeks of uncertainty. Observation, patience, and careful attention to detail had unveiled truths that others overlooked. She thought of the widow's letters, the hidden compartments, and the subtle clues embedded in the graves and village chatter. Even in a seemingly serene village, the dance of trust and treachery played out quietly, imperceptible to all but the attentive observer. The festival approached its peak, villagers moving in a gentle whirl of color and cheer, and Miss Marple allowed herself a small, contented smile. Justice had been done, the rightful secrets had been uncovered, and the community had learned the delicate balance between vigilance and kindness. The moral was clear. Appearances could deceive, and only through careful attention to the human heart could one glimpse the truths that lay beneath. Yet, as the golden light faded and the first chill of evening crept over the garden, a solitary raven alighted atop one of the seven graves. Its black eyes gleamed in the dimming light, its presence a silent reminder that not all mysteries were fully resolved. The bird remained for a moment, tilting its head as if observing the village below, before vanishing into the gathering dusk. Miss Marple watched it depart, noting the quiet symbolism of its visit, a subtle hint that while Rose Hill had regained its calm, the past still held whispers waiting to be heard. She rose slowly, brushing her hands on her skirt, and gazed once more at the neatly kept graves. The village continued its harvest celebrations, laughter and song drifting through the air, and yet the raven's shadow lingered in her mind. For in Rose Hill, as in all villages, the ordinary and the extraordinary coexisted, and some secrets, though hidden, refused to fade entirely. The story of the widow of Seven Graves was complete, for now, but the faintest murmur of mystery remained, teasing those wise enough to observe with patient attention. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops of Rose Hill, casting a warm golden glow across cobbled streets and tidy gardens, the village slowly settled back into its familiar rhythm. The scent of fresh bread and tea drifted from kitchens, Children played beneath the turning leaves, and the church bells rang lazily across the quiet lanes. Politeness and good humor returned to conversations, and neighbors exchanged gentle smiles, reassured by the calm that had once again enveloped their small world. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her garden, reflected on the weeks that had passed. The widow of 7 graves had revealed her secrets. Justice had been served, and the subtle threads of deceit had been carefully untangled. Yet the village remained alive with the gentle reminder that human nature, with all its charm and complexity, could never be fully contained. She sipped her tea, content in the knowledge that careful observation, patience, and understanding had restored harmony, even amidst hidden malice and long-buried grudges. And now, dear listeners, the story is yours to ponder. Which clue did you notice first? Did you suspect the shopkeeper, the mysterious visitor, or someone even more unexpected? How might you have solved the mystery if you had been walking through the streets of Rosehill alongside Miss Marple? If you enjoyed this tale, do leave a comment, share your thoughts, and click like. Your curiosity helps these cozy mysteries find new homes. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories where quiet villages conceal extraordinary secrets. Though the streets of Rosehill are calm once more, the lessons linger. Appearances can deceive, and the observant eye uncovers the truths that polite conversation might hide. Mysteries may fade, but understanding the human heart endures, leaving us thoughtful, cozy, and eager for the next secret waiting just beyond the garden gate.